You might remember the 1800s just for tales of the Wild West, but there's also a heap of delicious food that we've lost to time just waiting to be rediscovered. With an empty stomach and a love for all things tasty, let's get into the cuisine of the 1800s. So, calf's foot jelly was something that was originally introduced to the United States of our dear America all the way from Europe. Here, it was actually kind of considered typical farmstead food, but back there, it was a sign of having a more sophisticated palate. One of the biggest differences between the US and the UK is our approach to offal, or in other words, the least desirable parts of the animal. This was made by slowly simmering the feet of the calf to get all of the gelatin inside, and it wasn't just something people used to keep their hunger in check, it was also supposed to have rejuvenating qualities. People believed that it could help fortify your immune system, and that doesn't exactly escape the realm of possibility given how the mass understanding of nutrients and vitamins wasn't really too deep back then. Even if you take a look at memorable cookbooks from the time like the Virginia Housewife, you'll actually find a lot of ways to make calf's foot jelly. For about 10 cents, you could get some pretty handy jelly, so why not? Now, if you want to talk about something that's quintessentially American and something right out of the 1800s, then we can't miss out on some Indian pudding. It's a rustic, beautiful dish that's as old world as it gets. You would replace the Indian meal with cornmeal thanks to how much of it there was, which luckily is at least one thing that's ever changed about the South. Cookbooks like Lydia Maria's The American Frugal Housewife also showcase different ways of making Indian pudding. And in fact, in places like New England, it became a regional hit. People would serve it during Thanksgiving celebrations and make it party food, more or less. The flavor was also really similar to a custard made from cornmeal, and the sweetness of the molasses worked really well with the milk. It definitely had a lot of warm spices like cinnamon and ginger, though. I can get why this was such a party meal because it sounds really comforting from the accounts of cookbooks and family recipes left from the era. Salt rising bread was something that came right out of the Appalachian region. It wasn't as tasty as some of the other stuff we have lined up on the list, but it was extremely practical. Hey, if something gets useful enough, it gets a lot more wiggle room as far as taste is concerned. Commercial yeast was not a thing like it is now back then, obviously. You may not know to what extent, though. The only way you could easily get it is if you lived in urban areas, otherwise, you were out of luck. That's why bakers started to rely on naturally occurring fermentation techniques and processes. Starters that would use milk, potatoes, and cornmeal were some of the most popular. This bread didn't even have salt, which I'm not sure why it's in the name since it kind of makes it seem like a standout ingredient. The bread relied on things like hearths or salt boxes to get the warmth it needed, and it definitely was a skill you had to learn. Thanks to the way it didn't use yeast, it had a very distinctive flavor, which some people said was tangy and really nutty. Ragu mutton is something that just seems French from the name, doesn't it? As true as that is, its pricing couldn't be further apart from your typical imports of French culture and cuisine. See, back then the table was flipped pretty strongly. Mutton was actually cheaper than lamb or beef, meaning that loads of people had access to it. A pound of mutton would have ran you 5 cents on a good day and 10 on a hard one. And the quality and area was a big factor in that. This was one of the first instances of the American people using wine for their broths, which is something that the French have seemingly perfected. It's actually a really good showcase of how far back our European roots really go. So much of what people like about the food in America today is either an offshoot, variation, or a spin-off of a European dish that was introduced. From ragu muttons to bechamel sauces, I guess we've really grown our taste buds, haven't we? As far as the taste goes, though, this was a meal for a feast. The stew was rich, the mutton was as tender as could be, and the spices and herbs had an aroma that would spread for blocks and blocks. Syllabub might seem like a name for a Pokemon rather than any kind of real food, but it's actually one of the nicest and creamiest desserts you could get in the American frontier back then. During the colonial era, European settlers brought this into the country and, well, what can I say? Maybe you expected a big lore drop of 1800s colonial-era American history, but the truth is, people just liked it. At least the impulse to adopt good food is something we can agree on with everyone in the world. maybe a tad bit more than others. Syllabub was also kind of expensive, so it wasn't really something you would make for the fun of it. It's not that you would get it for high prices in stores, but Syllabub requires a lot of cream, wine, and spirits, as well as citrus fruits. It gets its name from how you're silling a bub, which refers to the frothiness you get from milk being poured directly into wine, which, by the way, would be right from the cow. You'd need either brandy or sherry to make it work, but oh my God, if you did have everything you needed, there was arguably nothing better you could make in the 1800s. I still think this is something we should try today, really. I mean, what else do we have that sounds like this? If you have any ideas, please let me know in the comments. Corn dodgers are some of the simplest things you can get from the 1800s. It's just proof that whether it be the frontier, the overall South, or our country 200 years ago, nothing and no one can take away an American's love of easy, quick, and tasty comfort food. These were dense little cakes made out of our favorite natural resource next to oil, cornmeal. Along with some water, milk, and salt, you would shape these into tiny little patties and balls that would then be baked if you were fortunate enough to have an oven back then, or just fried regularly. You would see travelers carrying around corn dodgers all the time because it was quick and easy nutrition, and you can really just find a dozen recipes in any Southern cookbook that's from the 1800s for corn dodgers. This was one of the most common everyday staples for people back then, and they were a cornerstone of the cuisine of the South back then. Soldiers, laborers, travelers, people who just did petty work, people with nowhere to go, and even rich people on long, hard, and dry trips would carry these. It's like their version of a granola bar, really. Black butter was a spiced fruit preserve that really got popular in the 19th century throughout the United States because of how good it was at preserving apples. This was something that was done by slowly simmering the apples along with cider, molasses, and spices like cinnamon. You would throw in some cloves there and wait until the mixture eventually turned into this dark, rich-looking caramelized mesh of all the previously mentioned ingredients. It was something that rural homes really stuck to, because not only did it help keep apples alive and fresh for longer, which were largely homegrown in that era, mind you, it was also something that would just work really well as a dip, spread, or a filling. It was the kind of thing you could put in a pie, over some toast, or with some biscuits, and just have a nicer meal overall. Probably while chatting away with your family, which is why a lot of texts from the 19th century refer to this as a comfort food. So, potted meat would run you anywhere between 10 to 15 cents in the 1800s. And if product marketing did exist in those times as we know it, then this one probably got the biggest benefits. Potted meat was all over cookbooks like Eliza Leslie's directions for cookery and newspapers, communal collections of recipes, and just something that would spread through word of mouth. Why, though? What's so special about meat in a pot? The thing is, potted meat was a practical solution to the age-old problem of food preservation. You got meat, well, hooray! Now what? Who's going to keep it clean? Safe? Preserved? You want that thing to last, don't you? Naturally, people came to solutions like potted meat because it offered them an extreme amount of convenience, as well as making their food easy to carry and transport. The reason this AWS is so popular with farmers and travelers alike is because both shared a really nomadic lifestyle depending on the time of the year or the state of the land. If there was a bad spell of weather and you had to get up and go somewhere else, it helped to have things like this in the back of your mind. Brown Windsor soup, on the other hand, is something that would look a lot different depending on the kind of table you were at. Were you in the far reaches of the South, in a humble farmstead? Then you would probably get an earthy soup made with things like homegrown onions, carrots, potatoes, a one-pot preparation. The end result would be a meaty soup with lots of nutrition, but maybe not a lot of flavor. If you were in the middle-class areas back then, well, you might see a sauce or two here and there, along with some more pricey herbs, but the real brown Windsor soup was something that only the elite got to enjoy. If you were having it with them, then you would get a soup with Worcestershire sauce, all kinds of exotic herbs, a sophisticated flavor profile, and the freshest root vegetables available, along with much more finer cuts of meat. It was actually a dish that highlighted the class differences back then, Although, regardless of how it was made and the quality of the ingredients, it was always a deeply soothing meal to have, especially in the winter times. That's why it got around so much, regardless of financial barriers. Seed cake is kind of in the same vein as Windsor soup. However, whereas you could probably find easy and available substitutes for Windsor soup even in rural areas, this was not something you could ever really change around too much. What that meant is that this dish was essentially something you would only ever find in urban hubs and areas, large towns, cities, and people who lived in communities with gates on them. For the working class, seed cake was a once-in-a-blue-moon type of thing. The reason it was so hard to get was because the seed cake was simple enough, but it required a hefty amount of flour, sugar, eggs, caraway seeds, and butter. While that doesn't sound like a lot to us, maybe it definitely was a meal that people who were living on a tight budget or a thin pantry would think twice about. In wealthier homes, though, seed cake was literally something to indulge in. It was served along with tea time, it was served as a dessert, it was brought out for guests. It's like if you could give them any excuse to pop out a seed cake, they would. That, again, just shows you how different the lifestyles were in America depending on the kind of area you were in. It did taste amazing, though. The crumb was heavy and dense. The sweetness was subtle but not too overbearing, and the richness and buttery smooth texture wasn't overwhelming. It was just right. There's a byproduct you get through the entire butchering process that we don't often talk about too much. It's called Suet, and the next item on our list has this as the star of the show. Suet pudding was, on the flip side, something that was actually very popular with middle to working class families back then. This was for two reasons. Suet pudding was economical, which obviously was a massive plus point back then, but it was also really high in calories. See, America's gone through a lot in the past 200 years. Now, if you say the words high-calorie content, then you might have someone counting their macros and micros on their fitness tracker to see if they can spare some room in their caloric deficit for a double Whopper. Back then, though, people had a much more deep appreciation for the energy food like this would provide. That's because everyone was working their bones dry in fields, factories, and just laboring the day away. While the men did that, women would often spend every last bit of energy trying to cater to homes and large families without any of our modern-day conveniences, and winters were a lot harder without modern-day insulation. Food that was cheap, energizing, and was also good at keeping you warm was a natural treasure for many. So what exactly goes on in your head when you hear frizzled beef? Is it maybe shredded beef, a little gnarly looking, maybe a little too savory? Or is it diced and sliced beef spread over a toast with some corn? It's actually far away from all kinds of things like that and not too different either. Again, this was something for the average Joe and his loving family instead of a bigwig with a fat purse and more lawn space than he knows what to do with. Frizzled beef was a 1800s classic that largely consisted of shredded beef that had been sautéed in just a little bit of animal fat or butter. People would then actually simmer it in milk and cream, and that would make a wonderful gravy. So you would be right in thinking that it's some kind of shredded beef, but you'd probably never guess how similar this is to a curry. Frizzled beef was something that people came up with as a way to stretch supplies of meat because if you could eat like 50% gravy, a little bit of meat, and a lot of bread, then you would be getting your appetite full, as well as saving a lot on your groceries. Making meat last was something that people really needed to think about back then because it's not like they could just go to whatever store they wanted and get a packet of boneless breast meat. Tomato jam was something that really showed you how much ingenuity people had back then. It was a dish that anyone could really enjoy, but it would be served and eaten really differently depending on the kind of company you had. For lots of working-class families, this looked like regularly making tomato jam to preserve tomatoes so that they could last throughout the year. In rich homes, on the other hand, this was a side to a lot of meals, and it was made with a lot more sophistication in tomatoes. They had no reason to be worrying about cost-effectiveness, after all. Eventually, people started thinking about different ways to maximize their summer harvests, and, well, refrigeration was a long way off. Mass-produced and industrialized canning wasn't really there either, though it was definitely something, but jamming was great. Jamming meant that you could make something out of a simple tomato and even make it taste better thanks to all the cinnamon and sugar people would throw in there. They'd even put in lemon juice. Oyster pie was a dish that you would never see outside of cities, though. It was a luxurious dish in the 20th century, especially throughout many areas of the East Coast. Why the East Coast in specific? Well, you make your pie depending on what you can find in the area, and it just so happened that oysters had taken up residentship a long time before Americans or Europeans had even settled in. Oyster pie was something that really took advantage of that, since a lot of the population could either fish for oysters or just outright afford them. Again, if you remember the Virginia housewife, which I mentioned a little bit at the start of the video, you'd find this dish on the front pages. It was elaborate, tough to make, had a complex flavor, and was pretty to look at. Where do you think I'm going with this? That's right, all the wealthy folks salivated over this dish like a pack of wild dogs, and they wanted to have the best oyster pie on the block. It became a symbol of wealth, affluence, and just having more money than you really need, but I'll be damned if it doesn't taste amazing. Luckily, this is at least one dish that's managed to make its way to the 2000s. Even if no one really makes it anymore, we still have the blueprint, right? Ciderkin was a really diluted version of fermented apple cider. It was a drink that you would see a lot throughout America during the 19th century because of the overall reliance on apples. The phrase "an apple a day keeps the doctor away" wasn't really a golden rule of thumb back then, but despite having that head start on them, people from the 1800s ate a lot more apples than you or I have probably consumed in all of 2024. Ciderkin was something that was born out of that reliance on apples, because if you have them that much, they're naturally going to be something you run out of fast. How filling even is an apple anyway? I think it's like a 3 out of 10, but I want you to share your ranking too. Back to Ciderkin. So, you would take the pressed pomace, which was the leftover pulp of the apple after the cider pressing was done, and you would put that in water and just let it ferment for a while. You would get a really alcoholic and tangy beverage at the end of all of this. Ciderkin was watery, light, and it had just a bit of a tang and a vague apple flavor. It wouldn't really hold a candle to regular cider. It was really easy to make though, and it helped people keep themselves refreshed. Hasty pudding was a really easy porridge you could make pretty much entirely from scratch back then. All you needed was some cornmeal, and then you would just boil it in water or milk. If you wanted to really get fancy with it, I guess you could throw in some molasses and sugar for extra sweetness. People would also try to flavor the porridge with butter and spices, and it would even double as a gravy in most places. Lots of families would use this because it was a cheap meal that fills you up easily, and they'd actually repeat it throughout the day. Hasty pudding was something that really lived up to its name because it was exactly what it sounds like. Quick, convenient, easy to make, and something you could do when you were in a hurry. See, traditionally speaking, lots of people used wheat flour to make their pudding, but since that wasn't available very often in rural areas, it became a lot more common to just go with cornmeal instead. What do you get when you take some salted cod? Mix it in with mashed potatoes, eggs, onions, and herbs, and mesh that into some balls and patties. Codfish balls were one of the most common kinds of meals you could ever find in America throughout that time, and it was entirely because they were such a massively abundant resource. You could literally stand in a river with your hands submerged and just catch your food. There were fish markets that would rely on cod as their bread and butter. There were loads of fishermen that would rely on this for their money and food both. Cod was always usually salted too, so that it would stay fresh for longer, and codfish balls were a way to turn the fish into a transportable and easy-to-make meal that required no fuss or any kind of fancy ingredients. Codfish balls were salty, a little creamy thanks to the potatoes, and usually crispy because they had been fried. They were the kind of thing you really would want to enjoy hot, and there were many children in the 1800s who had nothing but codfish balls as a big part of their daily lunch. Apple tanzi is a dish that comes right out of the 17th century era of Britain. Naturally, as with most things European that were brought over to America during this time period, they were all thanks to settlers and colonialism. That doesn't mean we can't enjoy some really nicely made apples, though. It's very rare that we end up agreeing with the British on something food-related, but I think this one might be worth a shot. So here, you slice up these apples, fry them in lots of butter, and then cover them with a very well-blended mixture of eggs, cream, and sugar. Lastly, you have your spice rub, which basically just looks like a generous serving of nutmeg and cinnamon. You'd then cook the dish until it would look pretty much how you would expect a pancake to. If you look at early cookbooks, then this was one of the most popular desserts to bake. It was really homely, sweet, and comforting. In wealthy homes, people would use the highest quality ingredients they could find, which would really elevate the dish a few levels. It was hard to beat it when it was made that nicely, but even modest ingredients gave you a pretty satisfying meal with this recipe. Speaking of desserts, there's probably no better time to talk about plum duff than now. You remember Suet pudding from just a short while ago? Well, there was another version of Suet pudding that would usually be made with flour, dried fruits like currants and raisins, and warm spices. It would have sugar, and rarely, if ever, it would have actual plums. There weren't just lots of culinary differences back then, we also had a lot of linguistic ones. People used to call any kind of dried fruit a plum back then, so it was very much an umbrella term than a specific label. It was something that became common during Christmas time for two reasons. It was really sweet, pretty looking and warm, so it was already a natural suit for winters. Then it was also really high in calories and energy, so it was the perfect kind of thing to have in long winters where you needed the extra boost to keep working. Plum duff, as comforting and nice as it sounds, was actually just a result of people trying to live as cheaply as possible. Though it came to a point where even middle-class and working families would rarely have plum duff, it was still something people made room for regardless of their budget. You know, dear viewer, in your lifetime, I bet you've heard of a lot of things. The Aurora Lights, orange jam, tomato jam, pineapple pizza. Hell, you've probably even seen vegan steaks at this point. Have you ever heard of mushroom ketchup, though? I bet I got you there. At least I hope I did. Anyway, if you're like me and you're immediately curious about how someone turns mushrooms into ketchup, since the last time we had someone transforming one thing into the complete opposite was Jesus, then buckle your seatbelts. Mushroom ketchup was a condiment that people made by extracting as much juice as possible from salted mushrooms. Then, they'd throw in spices like cloves, nutmeg, black pepper, and bottle it. It's actually something that people used all the time back to then help flavor their soups, stews, and their savory dishes. Modern tomato ketchup is bright, like a cherry red, and often really thick and rich, but mushroom ketchup was dark, thin, and it had an extremely strong umami flavor. This was something that was prized all over by people from every kind of background, because it would enhance the flavor of a dish like nothing else could. It was also a technique people really relied on because it was best used right before your mushrooms were about to spoil. So, slapjacks were basically the earliest version we had of pancakes. They were the kind of thing that were really known for their simplicity and how easy they were to prepare. Slapjack was something that people used different names for, like Johnny Cakes and/or Journey Cakes, but they were basically all just referring to griddled flat bread that had been made from a bit of animal fat, milk, and cornmeal. It was something you would see in mid-Atlantic states back then a lot, especially places and areas like New England. The more south you went, though, the more you would hear slapjack instead of any other kind of name. It was a really quick and easy way for people to have a pancake, and I'm sure you guys can relate to how necessary that is in your daily routine. Slapjacks were pretty much something exclusively tied to the working class, too. They were all dishes that were really considered too informal and country for the rich folk, so it's not something you'd ever see them openly eat. Though don't let that fool you. They definitely would sneak in a few dozen throughout the year. Venison pasties, on the other hand, were not something you would ever see rich folk eat at all, at least not in the traditional way. Of course, the traditional way was to hunt wild game like deer, skin and butcher it yourself, and then make the pastry. Of course, the rich folk way was to get someone else to do it for you. Still, it was very common for families that lived entirely off of hunting and families who were situated very much in the frontier to rely on meals like this. Venison pasties weren't some fancy European dish that relied a lot on cream and nice expensive spices. It was something that was made out of sheer necessity. The pasty format was not picked for its flavor or texture, but because it let you carry around meat easily. and it was much easier to preserve your meat in the form of a pasty than storing it in a bag. The filling was also really varied, and depending on the kind of things you had lying around, you'd get a pretty different pasty each time. It was earthy, gamey, and the kind of thing that any honest-to-God meathead would adore. Spotted dick was another offshoot of suet pudding. This is something that may have originated from British communities, but was something that went through a lot of transformation and practical reworking throughout its history in American kitchens early on in the 19th century. You call it spotted because there's so many different kinds of dried fruits spread throughout the batter, which really does give it the appearance of having spots. You would call it dick because, well, that was the umbrella term for pudding back then, apparently. Go figure, really. Traditionally speaking, you would steam and boil spotted dick so that it would make a warm and pudding-like dessert. It was meant to be inexpensive and the kind of thing that anyone could make. Traditionally, it was something that never required sweat, but when it came to America, it was necessary to include that in there because otherwise the pudding wouldn't get the fat it needed to help stay moist. You know, back in the day, all kinds of things used to be common catches. Cod, salmon, crab, even lobster, and among all that, there were also eels. From these eels, people would make something you might shudder at today, but was a delicacy back then: eel pies. These savory pies were the end result of a combination of many ingredients like herbs, stock, onions, and they were typically served with vegetables and potatoes as a side. Does any of that make you even a bit more comfortable at the thought of chewing down on some eel? Believe it or not, freshwater eels were extremely common in the lakes, rivers, and general waters of most coastal cities in 1800s America. Freshwater eels were the kind of thing that working-class communities relied on heavily because it was a natural, easy, and free source of protein. It was affordable, and also, you would have a difference of opinion on whether or not this was an informal dish. Now, naturally, no one below the rich people would care about that sort of stuff, but the rich families that were more so in urban cities with carriages would never touch this. The ones that settled in coastal cities by the sea would often enjoy higher quality versions of this. Either way, I know one thing. I'm never eating an eel, no matter how hungry I get. How do you feel about it? The history of rye and Injun broad is a long and complex one, and it's actually really poetic that we get to end the list on something that covers so many communities prominent in the 1800s. Basically, Injun bread was just cornbread, but it used to be a staple of Native Americans, especially in the South. However, people couldn't really deny the sheer practicality of this. It was made using corn and maize, so it was something that would pretty much always be around no matter what the situation or locality was. It became a fundamental part of the daily American diet, and honestly, that was a fact that continued well into even the 20th century. Cornbread was the lifeblood of working-class people. Rye bread, on the other hand, was made entirely from rye flour. It was one of the first ever grains that we cultivated in America. If you go to the northeastern or midwestern parts of the country, you can find a lot of history about how rye was pretty much the quintessential grain for a lot of people. It was a hard grain that did well in cold climates, and that was also the kind of temperature wheat never survived in. Rye bread, thus, became really common in working-class families. It was also a way for different families to differentiate themselves. White wheat-based bread became a sign of wealth and stability. Rye and Injun bread was created when people started mixing rye and corn together to create loaves of bread that were a hybrid. When families didn't have one or the other available, they would make do by taking scraps of both and using them this way. It actually worked a lot better than people had expected, and the bread had the benefits of both, while having an entirely new taste. Salmon loaf was another dish that went in the same direction as codfish cakes. In today's world, where you cannot have any kind of original experience since everything has already been invented and done apparently, salmon loaf was an interesting invention. Back in eras like the 1920s, there was more ground in the food world that was untrodden. People wanted new ideas, and the simple ones, like mixing foods that already work, went to the kitchen first. Among these combos was the salmon loaf. When you think of this, try to imagine a meatloaf replaced with salmon with cracker crumbs on top. A lot of people who thought a meatloaf tasted too gamey found this to be a perfect fit. Like the shoe you just know is right for you at the store, salmon loaf was a hit for many people. Especially in states like Alaska, known for their salmon, it went a bit out of fashion since people wanted to try out salmon in different dishes. If we take a look at how Porcupine meatballs made their claim to fame, then the answer is pretty easy, my friend. You take canned food, a sauce that gets simplified for everyday use, and budget-friendly, high-quality meatballs, and you have an easy winner in the eyes of the people. This dish costs nothing to make and requires the simplest of things from you. It's probably all stuff you already have in your home, to be honest. How often do we really find ourselves without any onions or rice? The sauce might be a bit tricky if you're new to it, but any canned tomato sauce would work too. All in all, it's extremely beginner-friendly. It caught on because between the casseroles, the meatloafs, and the pot roasts, people needed something different, but similar enough that it could work for them on a daily basis. What they ended up finding was porcupine meatballs, among many things, but the recipe is largely forgotten nowadays. You just don't get to see it being made much in households, probably because the prices are much higher than they used to be, and because there's been a massive rise in takeout culture on top of it all. Its golden days in the 1950s and 1970s are ancient history now. Potatoes are really starchy, and this gives them a lot of benefits outside the kitchen and your plate of food too. It helps them take away any kind of excess salt from your dish by just making sure that you don't have excessive moisture. As we have gone through so many times in this video already, the moisture amount in your food needs to be just right for a lot of things to work, as they ideally should. Potatoes, being composed almost entirely of starch, have a massive capacity for absorbing all kinds of liquids. You put raw potatoes into some kind of soup, stew, or sauce, and just watch as it takes away the liquid and salt. Most of the salty liquid gets absorbed by the potatoes thanks to a process known as osmosis. This is what happens when liquids or water move from one object to another to balance out the overall concentrations. The starches of the potato help to make a membrane that helps to draw the liquid into the potato. Plus, besides just that, potatoes are really good at diluting salt. Why does this help? It helps to keep the salt-to-food ratio low, which ensures that your steak or burger is just the right amount of bitter and not overpoweringly so. All in all, a little potatoes on the side have more benefits than you'd initially expect. Continuing the protein train, if you find yourself keeping the workout part of things on lockdown but not being able to manage the diet part of things, you'll see a lot of main ingredients being replaced with affordable and convenient substitutes here. It was just how you did things back then. People weren't exactly living the picture of fine dining back then. Scalloped potatoes and chopped picnic casseroles were recipes that really stuck true to that entire concept. So scalloped potatoes have been a favorite all over the States, and that only became more true during the war, but what about those casseroles? Well, normally this is just what you would call a leftover casserole. That's literally what it was, since a lot of people just used the recipe as a way to get rid of leftovers, which is also why it didn't see a lot of use back when things were okay. Skip to the 40s though, and you'll see nothing but praise for this dish. The concept here is a dish that's ready to eat right out of the fridge. Stale bread, crackers, canned meats like Spam, bits of sausages, and anything that could count as leftovers worked. Sometimes neither the scalloped potatoes nor the casserole was substantial enough on its own to fill a family. Put two and two together, and you have the closest thing to a picnic that you could get back then. Continuing on our potato express train, we have mashed potatoes with sour cream and chives. Mashed potatoes had one problem that very few things, food or otherwise, in history do have, and that was suffering from success. It was too good, the flavor was too great, and it even looked delicious. Eventually, people started to get a little bored of having the same amazing flavor always and wanted to know what more they could do with it. Thus began a very long rabbit hole of adding random ingredients to mashed potatoes, which was a mixed bag, historically speaking. You had some absolute train wrecks, but among the heap, you would find gold like sour cream and chive mashed potatoes. Something that redefined what it meant to have a lazy Sunday or a movie night. Families adored this simple wonder. What it brought to the table was happiness for like $4.50. As America explored the rabbit hole even deeper, it would leave dishes like this behind, which sucks for us. If you do hear wedding bells because of this dish, know you did a great job. Pork cassoulet was what you went for as far as everyday meals go if you wanted to work some pork into the weekly diet. Pork cassoulet featured pork shoulders, or sausages in particular, and some of the typical ingredients you're used to seeing with savory dishes. Tomatoes, onions, garlic, all your usual suspects. Except this time it uses white beans like Great Northern beans. The reason you ended a crock pot, particularly for this, is that it is a stew, and the pork needs to be browned. Now you can include breadcrumbs for a crunch on top, but it kind of messes with the stew-centric vibe, so people used to leave them out. As far as the flavor goes, this is all savory, and it does not hide that fact from you at all. The slow cooking really lets everything combine into one massive profile that feels like it's made up of many different flavors, instead of a lot of tastes fighting for which one gets to stand out the most. When this was popular, pork was leagues more affordable than it is today, and the fact that you could either make this into a stew or a casserole meant that a lot of families found a lot of use for it. It fit the tastes of almost every prolific area in the country, like California, the Pacific, or the South, and it did great at keeping everyone full. Pre-freezing pies really helps before you delve deep into that baking rabbit hole, and it's for two reasons. You get a much flakier crust, which I'm assuming is something you want, and the fillings also stay really even, which I know you want. So, there are some sciencey reasons behind why this happens, and we'll definitely be getting into them, but if you're here for the too long, didn't read the version, then basically, moisture control, temperature regulation, and it helps keep the fat. Now, for the actual explanation. So, pie dough has a lot of cold fat, and that's what helps make that really flaky texture in the first place. Pre-freezing helps to solidify that fact and make sure the fat remains as solid as it can be, and the fat hopefully maintains its structure too. Plus, when you usually bake a pie without freezing it, the soft, soggy, and moist filling can keep the bottom crust really soggy. And this is a problem because you always want a firm base for your pie. The cold temperature of a pie that's been pre-frozen is an entirely different ballgame, though. This helps slow the process down in the oven, and overall, the fat at the bottom of the dough solidifies before the filling has a chance to soften it up. The filling itself is also getting more set and firm, and that's because being frozen helps keep it in a solid state, which helps make sure that it cooks more evenly. So, just a small trip in the freezer can give your pie the pick-me-up it needed, huh? Split pea soup was always something that we enjoyed greatly, mostly thanks to our European neighbors in the States. They didn't become a nationwide sensation until the Depression and World War II hit, though. That entire period actually saw an insane spike in the general perception of beans, peas, and lentils. Basically, anything that was vaguely similar to that was suddenly God's greatest gift to Earth. This doesn't just have to do with the times being hard and there being a massive war going on either. It has to do, again, with some age-old state-backed peer pressure. A lot of people were lost in the face of rations and surpluses that just didn't make the cut or last very long. The tensions with the government were extraordinarily high, especially with a lot of people just being tired of the war effort. The government of the United States of America decided to encourage people to cultivate some new hobbies in these trying times. One of those happens to be foraging, and it was just as convenient as it sounds. Free food that you can gather right from nature itself, that no one has to pay for? You can definitely see why something like that went mainstream. If you seriously thought gelatin and tomatoes were controversial, keep your head on for baked pineapple ham. Yup, rings of pineapple stuffed to the max with every inch of ham you could squeeze in, then baked, sometimes with additions like brown sugar. Not really something the appetites of today could appreciate, but in Hawaii and other places in America with a niche love of fruits and meats together, this was the bomb. People drew a big red line at pineapples on pizza, but with ham, they were willing to excuse the crocodile under the bed. Maybe the flavor of ham worked better, or maybe it was the baking. Either way, you could often come into your friend's apartment and find these in the fridge back in the 1920s to 1930s. Comforting times with comforting foods, even if we do not see them today anymore. So you know how America and pulled pork go together like jam on toast, right? After all, it's something you can feed a whole crowd and have them feeling full and satisfied. It's a showstopper, but you can make a lot of easy things with it. Most dishes you can make and serve will have people asking you what your recipe is, but that's just how easy pulled pork is to work with. So, when I say this next sentence, hear it with an open mind. How do you feel about cherry cola pulled pork? Yeah, slow-cooked, barbecue-y, savory pulled pork left to simmer in a pool of cherry cola, barbecue sauce, and other seasonings. The first time I heard of this dish, I struggled just to imagine all of those flavors in one bite. Like, barbecue sauce is a dip, pulled pork is a main dish, and cherry cola is a drink. You're used to having all that separately, right? Despite that, since it was all made from things that were so readily available in most homes, and since it was right up the alley of home chefs in their slow-cooking era, it took off in a major way. Especially in the South, where everything involved in this dish is something people were already having on a daily basis. So wax paper really helps keep ice cream soft because it helps stop those nasty little ice crystals from forming thanks to cutting off its exposure to air. Ice cream tends to get, well, icy or hard over the course of its short life thanks to the large ice crystals that take shape over the surface. This makes it feel really grainy, and it almost means you need to bite the ice cream instead of licking it, and that's just not nice for anyone involved. Wax paper stops this problem right in its tracks by cutting off any exposure to the air, which means that the crystals don't really ever get the chance to form in the first place. This way, ice cream also doesn't lose any moisture as the wax paper helps to retain it. If you don't ever store your ice cream properly, that is, without any airtight sealing, it goes through something known as freezer burn. That happens when the surface of your ice cream gets dehydrated and gets exposed to just a bit too much air. Think of it like getting a cold, if your ice cream could even get that. Just a bit of wax paper takes care of all this, and for almost no effort too. I got a protein skillet with chickpeas and eggs with your name on it. This one makes use of 3 simple things: chickpeas, eggs, and spinach, and it's just as good as it sounds. This is like a natural-born steroid, the kind of thing to send your muscles into high gear immediately and get you meeting those protein requirements without any of the prep work. Don't feel like whipping up a fillet of grilled chicken with mashed potatoes and prepping your meals a night in advance? Don't feel like subjecting yourself to scoops of protein powder? Get ripped the natural way and have the benefit of a superfood all in one. This is one of the most refreshing skillets I could recommend, and honestly, it's one of the best post-workout meals too. Plus, expanding your horizons past just meat as a source of protein helps a lot. You get to take in different benefits of all kinds of foods while you also get what you originally wanted in your diet. Sometimes a cut of steak is what you need, but sometimes it wouldn't hurt to try some peas and beans. Speaking of crispy, everybody knows breadcrumbs and meat go together, and nothing proves that like codfish cakes. A nice way to jazz up a home party or a cute snack to bake for your partner? You could really make codfish cake with any white-skinned fish. Adding breadcrumbs, spices, and mashed potatoes into the mix was a set of flavors that was not that flexible. Looking into ancient history such as the 1900s, we can find some pretty early references to crispy cod in cakes. There is your food history fact of the day. Cod made the idea click so good that people went crazy over them. Go out for a stroll in the 1900s, and you could easily find this at any joint around the corner or food stall. A perfect crisp with a tender inner and all the savory flavors you would want in a comfort food. Sadly, as far as fishes go, people are looking for different catches for their meals now. We're going to continue the casserole show with Alpine chicken. This one got popular for more or less the same reasons the other two did. However, it had an extra kick that they didn't, and that was the addition of Swiss cheese. Americans will never get tired of a dish if it has a decent helping of cheese in it. So you shouldn't be too surprised that this is stuck in the minds of eaters and families like glue. Alpine chicken typically uses cream of mushroom soup and breadcrumbs or a stuffing mix layered in a dish that gets cooked until the cheese is melted. You also have your typical chicken breasts involved, but some people go for the thighs. It peaked in popularity during the post-war era when people really started looking for more ease in their cooking rather than sweating buckets after a day in the kitchen. You know how when you cook something, you rarely feel like eating it immediately? It's because cooking is a soul-sucking endeavor. It doesn't have to be, thanks to things like crock pots and recipes like Alpine chicken, which bring the fun back in food and make sure you actually get to rest and replenish that stamina tank. Plus, this was a dish that really got the crowd singing, and that's always one you want to keep on your roster. String is actually really good, not just for slicing your cake and your desserts, but for stringing up and trussing your poultry too. It helps keep the bird in a compact and even shape, which, as you may have obviously guessed, helps ensure that the bird cooks evenly too. Trussing your poultry with string helps to make sure that the bird is cooking evenly because of the fact that it helps maintain the overall shape of the bird. The legs and wings stay close to the body instead of away, and this helps the heat travel overall a lot more easily throughout the bird. You get uniform cooking this way, which is always better as opposed to, well, ununiform cooking. The poultry really keeps its moisture too, which is always good because, let's be honest, nobody likes eating a dry bird. The tight packaging helps to make sure the moisture doesn't get away, and the meat overall stays a lot more tender and juicy. Trussing also has an unexpected benefit, but since the body stays tighter and more together, the presentation ends up looking better too. This is a part of why trussing your bird around Thanksgiving became such a massively practiced hobby across the United States. After all, when the occasion is special, you don't just want to make a good bird, you want to make it look pretty sitting there with all the toppings too. Then there's the stuffing, which always tends to kill everyone's vibe when it overflows. The aesthetic appeal of the bird, combined with how it just overall cooks a lot better and stays more crispy too thanks to the even baking, means that there's almost never a reason not to truss your bird. You might have come here expecting a meal that could make you completely filled. That's why I want you to meet the ground beef Wellington, which is a pretty nifty little rendition of a classic. Sausages don't really set the bar too high. They make for a pretty good snack, and in some cases, with a bit of creativity, even a pretty good meal. A main course would be something that could fill you up and have you walk away feeling like you're completely full. Now, back in the days before 1945, which is when the microwave was patented, making a puff pastry was a real pain in the neck. You could try, and a lot of people would, but it was something you needed a good reason for. Not at all something you'd rely on for a quick meal to wash away the hunger. That's where ground beef came in, and man, this was a national win for boomers. The thing is, it was a much cheaper and less labor-intensive way to make it, and before this, Wellington was mostly something expensive that only the rich got often. The best part was that it was something that just needed an oven, and the beef itself was something you could sear up in on your stove. You didn't need anything like a microwave or any kind of fancy pastry-making skills. After all, quick, tasty, and easy is the American way. Half pork and half ground beef, Swedish meatballs were all delicious. Meatballs that were made this way tended to be smaller than typical meatballs people were used to. When Americans hear the word, they think of a couple of big fat balls on a pile of spaghetti. Now, we know that Swedish meatballs were smaller, but as a result, they had a denser flavor that lasted much longer. Actually, these tiny cluster bombs of flavor were being made out of two kinds of meat. Add an incredibly thick gravy with a potent meatball sauce and a cabinet's worth of spices to the mix. What you had then was a full-blown flavor experience that people could either have as delightful comfort food, if made in a hurry, or an actual exquisite meal. One you could take someone out on a date for or serve to your family happily. Those are now bygone days, unfortunately, as kids today are back to spaghetti and meatballs. As far as everyday meals go, it gets pretty hard to outdo candied carrots if you're a middle-class home in the mid-1900s. As I'm sure many of you can relate to today as well, the little goblin in your brain that demands a sugar rush every other day for comfort is something humans throughout time have experienced. How did they get their fix? Well, you couldn't just get a caramel mocha frap from Starbucks like today, but you could take some carrots, boil them, and coat them in a glaze that was made from honey, maple syrup, brown sugar, and butter. Not really something that would suit the tastes of today, right? But don't knock it until you try it, because it actually did really well. Candied food was this entire niche genre of cooking back then that got popular. The whole glaze aspect was something people loved applying to every dish to see what sticks. These were a side dish that also worked for kids, so they got a lot of mileage out of family gatherings and dinner parties. But even besides that, It's still a great way to work some carrots into your diet. As far as the taste goes, they definitely hit home. It feels like any other treat you'd be eating, though when we think of candy today, we might be more used to hard and mushy textures like in hard licorice or sour candies. This was tender though, and it would melt in your mouth. I bet you never thought of adding rice to your salt shakers to help keep the salt fresh and make sure it doesn't stick together, but it really does work. See, salt is good at absorbing moisture, but that doesn't mean that neat little property that we've discussed so much throughout this video doesn't come with some serious side effects. Salt ends up clumping together exactly because it's so good at keeping moisture in. And what's good at absorbing moisture from other things? Rice. Rice is amazing at doing this. It can even take it in from the air, so taking away some excess moisture from salt doesn't mean a thing to the tried and tested unit that is rice. As far as grains go, this one really comes in handy in all kinds of ways. Those large chunks of salt are really difficult to break apart any other way, but if you just throw in some rice into your result shaker, you'll find a world of convenience you didn't even know existed, and it was sitting under your nose all along. Now, when it comes to dieting, some people like whole wheat instead of the usual, and for them, I have another skillet-based meal. I'm going to have to go back to talking about how much we've borrowed from our British friends over in the United Kingdom. Bubble and squeak is quintessential British food after all. It was pretty genius too. This shares a theme with the picnic casseroles we just discussed because both were phenomenal ways to repurpose your leftovers. A lot of these dishes were powerhouses made exclusively out of stuff that was either left behind or simply was about to go bad. The earliest mention of bubble and squeak is in the 1700s, and that's just a pretty bare-bones meat and cabbage dish. Over time, it was adapted to the current situation, and meatless versions were made popular. These ones just prioritized using potatoes and vegetables, basically anything high in fiber. The reason you'd want that is because it'd keep you full for longer, which was always a godsend during the war. The potatoes would work as a binding agent. The leftover vegetables were chopped and mixed in for nutrition, and if you got super lucky, some corned beef or bacon would work really well for flavor. As far as the culture goes, bubble and squeak really emphasize the mentality of wasting absolutely nothing. Despite how humble the recipe is, it's definitely something that brought comfort to a lot of families. War or no war, who can say some mashed potatoes and greens haven't cheered them up at some point? This dish actually got popular for exactly the reasons you would think. Yes, landing your man through a happy stomach is a good way to get married by fall season. Land your man, baked beans suddenly are a tried and tested method. I mean, you don't get a moniker like that for nothing, right? These typically get served as a topping for bratwurst or hot dogs, or served as a side for a main event that lies more on the barbecue side. The beans are made with ground beef, onions, and bell peppers, so they definitely are the perfect side to any kind of savory or tangy experience. One of the best sauces to use was Texas Pete sauce, but any kind of Tabasco works. If you have hardwood smoked bacon, though, that's definitely what cookbooks recommend, along with Taco Bell seasoning. As far as beans, any kind of canned beans work, but if you're looking for a specific recommendation that really encapsulates that mid-1900s flavor profile, then you should go for Bush's original baked beans. Either way, you're in for a great time with these. Try making them for a special someone on a romantic evening, and maybe you might get lucky in other ways too. Baking soda is a renowned cleaner across the globe. Got cat piss on your bedsheet? Somebody puked because they couldn't handle their liquor? Just a bad day? Or was that burger not fresh enough? Whatever your stink-radiating issue is, baking soda is there to clean it, but why is it such a universal cleaner? I mean, what singles this one thing out as a cleaner that works in every situation when everything else has designated specialized things specifically built to clean it? This is because baking soda has all the properties you would need in a cleaner. It's only just slightly abrasive, and as we discussed with salt, that really helps in removing unwanted surfaces without causing any kind of bad damage. So that means all of your dirt, any unwanted stains, or just plain old grease buildup are all things baking soda excels at taking care of. The particles of soda are also pretty similar to salt in that they're also very coarse, and this helps clean grime too. Baking soda on top of this is ever so slightly alkaline too. It has a pH of around 9, and most common stains and issues you'll find in homes are pretty acidic. Things like baking soda help neutralize that by breaking down the oils in them, and that helps keep the stains away. It also helps take away the odors from any kind of spoiled food or excess waste too. Again, this is because these odors happen as a result of acid, and as we now know, baking soda is pretty good at canceling that out. So if you ever wanted to see an actual jack of all trades, here you go. For you, my dear effort-allergic viewer, I have sheet pan granolas, which are actually so much better for you than you'll even think to realize. Don't worry, I hate baking too, and I especially hate eating oatmeal as it is. But with this combination, I can kind of get the best of all three worlds. Rolled oats are used as the base of the granola before nuts and seeds are added, finally topping it all off with a honey or maple syrup glaze that really helps the oats stick together and seal that crunchiness in. End result? You get your protein, your sugar, and your dry fruits together all in one, and it barely takes a minute of baking. Get a crunchy and nice granola going for literally none of the effort or money. Isn't it the most American thing ever to work smart and not hard? The thing is, we could all use a lot more oats in our diet than we normally have right now. It's not just the protein thing. They have a host of other benefits. You know how much fiber is in these things? That also has the added benefit of keeping you full for longer. You got to invest in different ways of getting it in your system to keep things fresh. Apricot glazed chicken is another dish that has just as much versatility as the last one, because you could really customize this dish. Depending on the average 20-something-year-old's mood back then, you had either a simple comfort meal or an "oh wow, you can cook" dish. You know the kind of thing you make for your friends when you really want to show off those kitchen skills? An apricot glaze could be made with simple ingredients like soy sauce and mustard, or use a lot more spices and seasonings to create an explosive coating. One that found a perfect place for itself on top of a golden brown grilled chicken. Ironically, when the pairing first started getting popular, that was when apricots finally found a home for themselves in the diets of American people. Nowadays, production for the fruit has been on a steep decline for the past 20 years, and glazed chicken like this is a thing of the past. If we take a small intermission from the dessert side of things and step on over to some hearty, comforting, and homely soups, we'll find a golden recipe lost among the cookbooks of the 20th century that don't get to see the light of day anymore. Pea and ham soup got its name because of how affordable it was. This is probably the cheapest thing on the list to make. Actually, it literally costs just a few cents. All you needed was ham and peas. You'd simmer them in the crock pot with diced ham and some vegetables like potatoes and celery, then slow cook it until the soup got thickened. You'd get this incredibly creamy, lovely soup that was just perfect for winter nights or after a long, exhausting weekend. Maybe you want to ease up on your stomach and eat something healthy for a change, but you still want some familiar flavors to keep you company. A soup like this would be right up your alley. It costs nothing, feels better than most things, and you can make it any time. You could probably even take a nap and wake up to the scent of the soup slowly cooking, becoming the final product. Okay, so you don't have any string to slice your cake with, and your knife just isn't sharp enough to make the cut, literally. What do you do? Would you believe me if I said that soap bars actually help sharpen your knives? While they'll never help do the job as well as a sharpening rod or some kind of whetstone, they can work as a last resort in a tricky situation where you really need just a bit more of an edge. Again, literally. The reason soap bars are so good for this is because of a combination of a few things we've discussed so far in the video and a few things that we haven't. So, basically, soap bars are lubricating, and you all know that. The soap helps cool down the blade by reducing the overall friction, and while you'd think this is counterproductive to sharpening, it really just means that smoother sharpening can happen since the blade doesn't overheat. This helps preserve the overall standard of your steel. So, soap isn't really that abrasive, but it is slightly abrasive, and this helps sharpen the blade just a little bit thanks to the really gritty particles you find in most bars. It also helps clean the knife, obviously, and that can really help restore some of the edge of the blade. While I bet you had no idea any of this was possible, now you know soap bars are officially in your list of things that help keep that knife cutting edge. Okay, I'm sorry, that's the last one. Salmon is such a widely caught fish in Alaska that salmon beef jerky should barely come as a surprise. Eggs, salmon beef jerky with a side of toast, was a cheap and common breakfast in diners and pubs in the state in the 70s. People would often have slices of beef jerky and use it in other dishes too, like casseroles or meatloafs. The 1800s were interesting, right? That wraps up our list of 25 forgotten recipes that no one makes anymore. Comment which food stood out to you and don't forget to like and subscribe.